welcome to this week's SV Lynx video. Oh my gosh, we are almost done with fairing and sanding.
At least on the port hull. Of course, we're going to be getting to building the starboard hull. In fact, we've already gotten started on that, as you're going to see in just a minute. But we've also had a couple problems this week, so we'll share that with you as well, show the good and the bad. And we have a new subject at the end of the video because we had a little change in the order of things. We're going to go over that in there and show you what the best bottom paint is and why we're talking about this. So let's get over the lot and get to it. Before we get to the lot, we had a surprise delivery. Put it right over here. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. All right, Admiral. We have a diesel engine.
We have presents today.
Yeah. Quite a large one.
Yes.
Now we'll have to get the DeRuyters over here with their Bobcat so we can move it to the lot.
Yep.
Hey.
Howdy!
I don't know if you remember Ron. He was at your unloading day.
Hey, Ron.
Hi.
That makes you official part of the SV Lynx crew. So you haven't seen the boat since we unloaded yet, huh?
Have not.
All right. Well, you will today. Very handy having a friend with a Bobcat. In the box, this thing weighs a little over 800 pounds. And so that wasn't something that we were going to be picking up and hoisting ourselves. It's a bit heavy for it. So, nice having the Bobcat. All right, well, so we got the diesel at my house. The reason it was delivered to my house was simply that the tax rate in my city is slightly different than the tax rate here. So it saved me money having it shipped to my house. And we just moved it over here with the Bobcat anyway. We had to get the Bobcat to load it on the lot because the shipping company wouldn't do that. So we had to have the Bobcat anyway. So we went ahead and shipped it to my house. And now it's going to be pulled in and set right over here. This should be out of the way. That still leaves us enough room over here to build the cabin top if the engine's still in place there, although it probably won't be because once we get these holes done over here, we've got to put the engine in there anyway, so this will get cleared out before we do the cabin top, so that's probably not an issue, but at least it'll be out of the way of walking around and such over on the side here. So Brian's mixing up epoxy right now because we're about to do round 6 on this side and round 7 on the other. So we've got them all marked, all the spots. In fact, let me show you that. And since the hull's becoming quite tattooed with old marks, see, like that one's fine. That's actually has epoxy over it. It's just translucent, so you can't really, cover it. It shows through. So we've got triangular marks now where we want new fixes put in. So you can see there's quite a few of these because this is only round 6 on this one. But here's some old ones. This is pretty good right here, so really don't need to do these two, but that's the bad spot right there. That's actually a triangle. So here, that's fine. Old mark, new mark, because there's a slight dip right there. So I'm about to fill those in. And then the other side has far fewer, and the ones that are over there are very thin fixes, so we won't have to do so much sanding over there, but it is close. We're hoping that round 7 is the last one on that one. So we finally have gotten started on the starboard hull, and we've gotten the first 10 strips cut. But that's as far as we could get, because the next thing we have to do is pull 2 very large panels out of the storage container and put a biscuit in. We're going to try and get to that tomorrow so we can cut all the rest. So the first 10 are cut, we got 40 to go. Okay, on the endless sanding and fairing, we spared you watching us do round 7 on this side and 6 on this side. Today, we're sanding round 8 on this side and round 7 on this side. So it's getting closer, and I keep saying that, but I'm picky, and this needs to look nice, and so every time we find a little bit of something more, we have to go fix it. But you know, if you look down the hull here from the side, it's looking very nice. It's just that when we run our hand over it, we can find just a little something, and so we fix it. And so until we can't find anything, we have to keep going. So there's a light coat on here that you probably can't see, but it's where the 7s are marked. So you can see we're on round 7 here. We've already epoxied those. We sanded the whole hull yesterday on the other round and faired the whole hull with the fairing compound, and now we're going to sand 7 on that side. And on this side, we're over to, you can sort of read it, 8s. Over here. So I'm going to start down this side right here with the flexi sander some, and Brian's going to start down this side with the torture board. All right, off we go. Got a blowout. Get my vacuum back on. All right, take a short break from sanding the other side. I thought I'd come over here and check up on Brian's work, and this is coming out spectacularly now. This is nearly done. I mean, that's completely smooth everywhere here. Yep. This side is now ahead of that side, even though this one's only had 7 and that's on layer 8. But that's going to take a 9 for sure, maybe a 10 even. But this one, this is feeling like a hull should feel like. Very smooth. So we've got the right amount of fill in the gaps here. The problem with the other side is there's still some ripples this direction, and that means we need to fill in more with the fairing compound going like this direction rather than just down. So that side's going to take a little bit more. On this side, we may be down to just a couple tiny little spots because this is feeling like finished. Very exciting. I can't tell you how exciting that is to get close to being finished on this. Yay. And yes, I'm sanding this side over here. Now, on this side, I can feel a little bit more ripples in a few places, like this one right there. But most of it's pretty good. This will take a little bit more work than the other side on the next round, but it's getting there as well. I mean, this whole section right here feels really good. Little spot right there that's rough. So, more sanding. We're going to try to get down to the end of the boat here, and then we'll go to lunch. Brian's busy using our compressor to blow off the major amounts of dust off of here. And I'm going to do a little test with Dycom Blue dye in some alcohol, and we're going to wipe down the hull with this. The idea is here is that the alcohol is going to dry and leave the blue. We'll see how that works. Trying to create as a sort of guide code here. All right, well, now that the alcohol is evaporating off, we'll go ahead and sand this and see if we can see where the low spots are. We'll see how that works. This is too curvy for that sander, so I'll get the flexi sander and we'll see if that helps. Grab a little handheld here. So what you can see here is where it's gone very white, that's where the flexi sander is hitting a high spot, and where it's dark is where the dye is left, and that's a low spot. So the question is, if I sand this down a little bit more, will that suddenly start taking the dye off? We'll find out. But you can see another kind of a dark spot there. One difficulty in this is that it's hard to see on these dark spots due to the basalt if that's got that purple in there, because the purple is so light. But where it's over here on the white stuff, you can see that right there is a low spot, right there is a high spot and a high spot. So again, you can sand this a little bit more and see if this gets down to that suddenly. And what's hard is, I can tell you right now, from a feel, that feels perfectly smooth. But this dye shows that it's not quite perfectly smooth. All right, so here's the verdict on the Daikon Blue. We don't think it's really worth it to put it over the whole hull. And the reason for that is that we can really see the high and low spots without it. And I don't know if it'll show up on camera, I'm gonna try, but we just sanded right here, and you can see white there, and you can see white through this section right here. This is all where it's sanded. This dark spot right here, you can see that, it's kind of a yellowish. That's where it hasn't sanded. That's a low spot. Now, if I had put purple dye there, it would still be purple there, but I can see it just by sanding the darker yellow versus the lighter. So I don't know why we're putting the dye on, since we can see right on the fairing compound where the low spots are just by the yellow versus the white. All right, well, I finished sanding the section of the Daikon Blue that we put on. I went to about here. And I will say that this is 99% done now. That means there's like one little spot there and one little spot forward there, and the rest of this may not look it, but this is perfect, ready for paint. So we'll touch up a couple little spots, just really like 3 right there, and sand the rest of this, and same thing. But I would say that the next maybe 10 little patches that we'll do will be the final. We'll call this one done, because this side is feeling just like I want. Smooth, ready for paint. Well, we ran into a problem, and our problem was simply that we were sanding over on the hull over here with our flexi sander, and it just stopped. But it wasn't the flexi sander, it's fine. The problem is that our Victron equipment has gotten some kind of a short in it. Now, we've triple checked the wiring, and also it's been running for 4 months without any issues. So It's nothing that we hooked up wrong, and it has caused us a lot of trouble. Let me show you a little bit. Hopefully it's not too dark in here. So our Victron equipment is up on the wall here, and right now you can see that some of the covers are off. And what happened was that it shut off power, and we weren't sure why. And so we started doing some troubleshooting on it, and that's where we ran into even more problems. The first thing we noticed is that the Servo GX up top there was no longer running the screen down below here. So the Turbo GX used to be right up there. We've got it off right now because we have to send it back in. It's been blown, and it connects to the screen, and that screen was off. That told us that that wasn't working. And our batteries were shutting off because of this. So we didn't know what was going on. So we took the batteries down here and we unhooked them all, and we hooked just two up. So it's just one set of two 24 batteries together. And when we hooked those two batteries up, it didn't have them connected to the system. They were on and working fine. We tested them, right voltage coming out, everything was fine about these batteries. But when we hooked them back into the Lynx distributor here, these are where the batteries come in. And when we did that, and again, screws a little light, but we have no lights because we have no power right now. Let me get a little light in here. There, that's a little bit. So, flashlight. It comes in here, comes through this shunt, comes out here, and this takes it to the inverter right here. And then the solar comes in up top there, and it goes through all these MPPTs. They connect down through their own bus bar inside of here, and then they come up into this Lynx distributor here to add power in. So power comes in through there, or it comes from the batteries this direction for coming out of the batteries. And either way, the power can go into the inverter, and that powers, this is a 230 volt European power inverter, so it can supply our European flexi sander. All right, so that's how it's supposed to work. But one of these two batteries were just two batteries, so we made sure there was nothing going on down there. When we flipped them back on again, then only one of the batteries came on. And I looked into the software on the battery, and it said that there was a detected short. It listed right in the software. So we shut them back off and came up top here and tried to figure out what, this whole Victron system was causing a short. Now, mind you, again, this has been running for 4 months, so it's not like the short existed before then. The BMSs never reported short. It was all working fine. We used it for all this time. So something has burned out. We don't know, and caused a short, because we didn't change anything. The troubles even got worse, because we shut those two batteries off after the one reported a short, and after we tried to figure out what was causing the short, we turned them back on again, and only one of the batteries came on. And what we discovered was that short had blown out the BMS in the battery. So again, we tried some things and trying to figure out what the short was, and then we hooked up two other batteries and thinking we might have had it, and we turned those on and it blew out another BMS because the short was still in there. What we're doing is we started taking out equipment, and we moved the battery connection over here, got rid of the shunt and all that stuff, and eventually that did get it to work. And we used it for a day of sanding, and we figured, well, there's some kind of short in one of these three pieces here that's causing the trouble. We hadn't figured out which one yet. So we rewired up two more of the batteries, since it was working, to 4 of them. And we thought that the problem was this inverter, because we disconnected this inverter and it was all working. That turns out to unfortunately not be the case. So we hooked up 4 batteries thinking we'd found the short, and when we turned it on, it blew 2 BMSs. So now we're down 3. And so it wasn't the inverter. Anyway, we did some more testing, taking pieces of equipment in and out, and when we finally hooked up another 2 batteries, we blew yet another BMS. And so we got to the point now where we've blown 5 of the 6 BMSs, and we have still not discovered, other than it's probably in this Lynx shunt, but it's no easy way to figure out why that is. When we use a voltmeter on here, we're not finding that short. It's the BMSs that report the short in the battery, but then it screws up the BMSs. So, as I said, big problem. So to keep working, what we've done is that I've reordered all new BMSs for the batteries, because we only have 1 working, 1 out of 6. So I've reordered all 6 new. And the reason I ordered all 6 new is because I'm taking this opportunity to fix a previous problem where we only had 100 amps per BMS continuous. And that was just in the fine print. They said 200 amps when I bought them, but of course in the fine print it said 100 continuous, and I didn't notice that. We need 200 continuous. And so I've replaced, the ones I bought to replace them are 200 amp continuous. So I don't want to say that was a silver lining, but at least we're getting the BMSs we need in here when we replace them. Our biggest problem is we still don't know which one of those units was blowing these out, and we're terrified to hook up any more batteries and screw up those expensive BMSs. For now, we're going to still keep it work, and the way we're going to do it is I've ordered a transformer, and we have a gas generator. It's always been a backup, and we'll use the gas generator with the transformer, and that'll power our sander. So that's what we're going to do for the next couple weeks while the new BMSs are shipping to us, while we discover what the problem is with this Victron equipment that's blowing up our BMSs and all that good stuff. So it's been a big problem this week, and it's just something we're going to have to deal with. But we're going to keep working by using the generator. And so that stuff's all ordered, and it's coming.
So we've had a bit of trouble this week over at the lot with our electric system, but we do have solves for many of the problems we've had there. So we don't want to talk about that anymore.
No.
We're going to talk about something much more fun and interesting, and that would be the anti-fouling coatings that there are that we might be choosing for our particular boat. And we are going to reorder the process a little bit here. And we're thinking about putting on our coating before we flip the hulls in the cradles.
Yeah, and the reason for that is simply that those cradles are very large, and they take up a big swath of the hull there, and we won't be able to get our anti-fouling on there. Now normally what's done is when you lift the boat with the crane, you would paint it at that point, the part that was missing, and 2 or 3, 4 hours later you would launch it into the water, and that would be fine. But that's really not going to work for what we're choosing to do. So because of that, we decided to go ahead and do things out of order and go ahead and put the anti-fouling on early. We'll get into why in a moment. Now there are many, many different brands of anti-fouling, and we're not trying to tell you one is better than the other. There are plenty of articles out there, like Practical Sailor has one that breaks down and tests all these different brands and such, and you can go read that stuff. I'll link them down in the description. But for us, we want to talk about the types of anti-fouling and why we chose the one we did. So let's get started into that.
Yeah. So there are 2 basic types of anti-fouling coatings, ablative and hard.
Right. And the main difference between the 2 is that ablative is often a water-based paint that you put onto the hull, and then over time it wears off, and so as growth happens on it, that flakes off, and so it gets thinner and thinner and thinner as that keeps losing paint to get the marine growth off of your boat, until eventually you get down to the primer, and then it's time to repaint again. And that usually happens within 1 to 2 years, depending on the brand of anti-fouling and, of course, your usage of the boat. And these paints are good for a slower sailboat, which sort of we are. I know we're a performance boat, but in the grand scheme of things, even a performance sailboat is fairly slow compared to, say, a speedboat, a motorboat. So they're good paints for that. Now the other one is the hard paints, and these are often epoxy based, and they're a paint that it doesn't come off. And what you do is you scrape off the barnacles and things that grow on there, whatever does grow. Obviously they have things like copper and other biocides into them. But you can scrape them off hard without worrying too much about scraping off the hard surface. Let's talk about a couple of the pros and cons of those things. Hard paint is great in the sense that you can scrape it off without losing the paint, but that means that when it does wear out, and again, that's still a couple of years into the life of the paint, you have to sand it all off, otherwise you start getting buildup of coat after coat of the hard paint, where when you're dealing with an ablative, most of that is getting worn off, and it's a little bit of sanding, but not anywhere near as much when you're going to put the next coat on. So those are those two basic types, but there are more to that story than just those two, and so let's get into that next.
So of the two basic types that we've just talked about, there's sort of a subcategory, silicone, which is very slick, and if you get your boat up to any speed, say 9-10 knots, it is so slick that the movement of the water takes off anything that's, you know, stuck to your hull.
Right, because it's so slick it really can't get a hold, and it slides right off. And that sounds really great. In fact, this was the bottom paint, and notice past tense there. This was the bottom paint that we were thinking about applying to the boat, because we love the idea that it is better for the environment, because when you're talking about an ablative paint, you're getting, especially if it has copper and such in it, as it's coming off, it's going into the water. And so it's not quite as good for the environment there. So we thought, well, we got the silicone coating on there. It doesn't slough off, and we don't even have to wipe it as much because it'll just come off as we sail. Perfect. We're a performance boat. We should be able to hit some of those speeds and keep that hull clean. Until we learned that, unfortunately, that slickness comes with two problems. The first one is not as big a deal, but it is something of small concern here, is when you lift a boat that's that slippery, if they're not really careful, you can literally slide out of the slings as they lift your boat. That's how slippery this stuff is. So you have to take, the lifters have to take special care when they're dealing with a boat that has silicone on it for a bottom paint when they're lifting your boat in or out. And sure, we could tell them to be careful and all that stuff, but there'd always be that little bit of nagging worry that they weren't careful, and our very, very, very expensive in time and money boat falls off, and that would be a disaster. So that is not the main reason, though, that we didn't go with it. That's just a small reason. The main reason we didn't go with it, we found out that the silicone is very susceptible to abrasion. So if you beach your boat often, it's going to wear that stuff right off. Or even when you put it in the slings, you could lose a piece, right? Some of the material right there, the slickness. So anywhere you take the slickness off, then you get growth. And so I wasn't thrilled with the whole idea of that, because we plan to beach our boat in quite a few places in the world. And so we don't want something that is not going to last through abrasion like that. So we had to go back to the drawing board and decide on a different bottom paint for that. Which brings me to another category, a subcategory. And this still goes into the hard paint, but it's not quite the same. And the real difference here is how long it lasts. All of the things we've talked about so far are 1 to 2 years, and then you've got to strip it down and put on new coatings. There's one kind that you can go longer that we know of. There may be others that we don't know of, but of the ones we've researched, only, and this is a brand name now, Copper Coat lasts much longer. And that is what we are going to put onto our boat. And now we're going to talk a little bit about why we want to use Copper Coat.
So you may have heard of the name Copper Coat before. And when we did some research on the net, we found out there was a lot of misinformation out there. And so we really dug into it, and we want to set some of that straight.
Right. So let's begin with a couple of the different things I've read in some forum discussions about it. For example, the sailing channel UMA put on a bottom paint, well, it's actually a bottom epoxy with copper in it. But they did a do-it-yourself version of that, and they didn't use Copper Coat. And they were very clear about that in their video. They said, this is not Copper Coat. And in fact, they did a follow-up video later that they said, the stuff we didn't work out very well, so why we switched to a different bottom paint, but we didn't use the brand Copper Coat, and they have other things in there, different biocides and such, that it probably worked much better. But I've read in a lot of posts people saying, well, Sailing Uma used Copper Coat and they didn't like it. Not true. They did a do-it-yourself and they didn't like that, but they never tested Copper Coat. So that's one thing. The second one is, there's a lot of people who are out there saying that it's Copper Coat and therefore it's illegal in many places in the world because a lot of places are cracking down on copper bottom paints. That's not true. Just because it has the word copper in the name, it's not the same as the ablative ones that have copper in there and that comes off into the water. This is a hard epoxy and it stays attached to the hull. In fact, in one of the most difficult places to get approval, California, the EPA has approved Copper Coat as a bottom paint here. So it's really not a problem to use Copper Coat in different places in the world. And then the next one is, there's a lot of people who have said, well, it's really expensive, and then after a year or two it flaked off and it was useless and I wish I'd never got it. That's because the application of Copper Coat onto your hulls is, there's directions that you need to follow, and you need to follow them carefully. If you do, this stuff lasts 10 to 12 years. Now, as far as how expensive it is, it's not. In fact, we looked into it, and if you just compare the cost of the Copper Coat versus the cost of a typical bottom paint that you have to put on 5 times compared to the Copper Coat one, they come out to about the same price within nothing difference. And we may not have to pull our boat out of the water as often because we don't have to redo our bottom paint. So does that mean that Copper Coat has no maintenance over the 10 to 12 years? Absolutely not. For us, and again, this really depends on what you're doing, but we're doing a circumnavigation on a large performance catamaran, and the large part of it is really the beam. We're 26 feet wide, and therefore there aren't a lot of places in the world that can pull our catamaran out of the water. So the fewer times that we have to get lifted out, the better. And by going with Copper Coat, we can cut down those numbers of times that we have to get lifted out. And that's another thing in the cost. If we get lifted out 3 times less, let's say, than if we have to actually paint the bottom every 2 years or sooner, that could save us more than the cost of the entire Copper Coat. So that could be $2,000, $3,000 worth of savings. So, you know, in the long run, if we're not comparing just the product, but we're also comparing the less number of haul outs, then it's much cheaper. And so for us, that is a big point. But there's other reasons that we want to go with it as well.
For example, some of the other anti-fouling paints can't be out of the water very long. Copper Coat can be out and dry.
Exactly. And another great thing is that this is a hard epoxy, and that means that it adds to the protection of our fiberglass underneath as far as any kind of blistering or any kind of problems like that. It goes right over the top of our epoxy barrier coat that we're going to put on. And so it really works well for those reasons. And since, as I mentioned, we're going to be beaching our boat in many places, this again is very hard and therefore very good at not getting rubbed off when we, beach it or any other thing that touches the hull, like if we do have to lift it out or whatever. So that makes this a much more durable epoxy antifoul for our boat than it would be. If we weren't sailing all the way around the world and beaching our boat all the different places and things like that, no, we might not consider Copper Coat. But again, even if you're not, from a cost standpoint, if you include all those haul outs, it's still a really good deal. Of course, the negatives is you have to put the money out up front rather than spread it out over 10 years. So that is a negative. We have to put the major cost up front. But in the long run, it'll actually save us money. So I'm good with that.
Yep.
So for that reason, we're going to be putting Copper Coat on. And they have agreed to sponsor our channel, so thank you, Coppercoat. And we appreciate them getting on board with us. And it also means that you're going to see us be putting on the Coppercoat very soon. And so that changed a little bit of how we're working the lot. So, and Marianne mentioned this, but I just want to explain it a little deeper. We were going to take the hull that we've, the canoe portion that we have finished and flip it over onto its cradles. We're no longer going to do that. What we're going to do now is we're building a new set of stands, just some 2x4, so not expensive. And we're going to move it, but we're not going to flip it. That way we can continue to work on that canoe, for example, putting on the barrier coat that we're going to start with, while we build the other strip planking of the other canoe. And so we'll have both, and we can go back and forth. That'll speed up time, because as epoxy's curing over here, we can go over this side and work on some stuff. And it also means that when we get to the point where we put the Coppercoat on, both of these canoes will be done. And we'll apply Coppercoat to both of them. And once it's done, then we'll bring the bobcat in and we'll flip both of them over onto their cradles at the same time. And that way, 2 years later, approximately, when we go to put this thing in the water, that bottom is already done. We won't have to patch it and do any problems there. And with Coppercoat, that could be an issue, because it's really important that the application is done properly, and that is multiple layers that you have to put down. And you have to have a day that the temperature and the humidity are correct when you do it. And because of that, I don't want to be constrained to the one day our crane's coming to move the boat that we have to do it on that day, because what if the weather isn't perfect for applying that part? But once these two canoes are done, we should be right into fall. That's perfect weather, not humid here and not too hot here. It'll be right in the perfect temperature and humidity zone. We'll wait for the perfect day and we'll just do those hulls. And so by doing it that way and putting it directly onto the hulls, the canoes that have our epoxy and then our epoxy barrier coat there, we get to lay this on absolutely properly at the right time and everything. And so that is one of the difficulties that some people face if they want to do Coppercoat. If they've got an older boat and they've got a different kind of anti-foul paint on there, they have to sand that back down to the epoxy level. We don't have to do that. We're already there. And so that's another reason why doing this is not a bad deal for us to go with Coppercoat. And when it comes time 10 or 12 years from now that we have to put a new coat of Coppercoat on, it can be laid down over the previous layer of Coppercoat. So, and then it'll last another 10 years, and that's about as long as we could probably imagine us sailing this boat. So that's why we've chosen Coppercoat, for that longevity, the hardness, for our beaching of the boat, and the fact that we're a brand new hull, so it's going to be easier to apply this and get a great finish on it. Well, so that does it for this week. And I would like to thank you all for watching. We will get that electric system working. Maybe not for a week or two, but that's okay. It's not going to stop us. We've ordered that transformer. It's already come in. And that means that we have our generator and our transformer, and we can use our sander tomorrow. So there's nothing stopping us from continuing on any of the jobs that we have to do while we get those batteries back up and running again. So not that it was the batteries that were the problem. The batteries have functioned perfectly. There's a short somewhere in the rest of the electronics, and we'll hunt that down, and then we'll hook the new BMSs up and get that whole system back online. But no big deal there. So again, thank you for watching, and thank you to our patrons. We appreciate you supporting the project. It's really nice to know that there's support out there. And so, you know, this is a big project, and frankly, it's almost overwhelming. It's such a huge thing to take on. I say almost because it isn't. I knew what I was getting into, and it hasn't been anything that has shocked me. And there will be further bumps in the road coming. We expect those. So we're not going to get down because we have some problem like this. We'll just move on. We expect to have these little bumps. So anyway, thank you all.
Thank you. And don't forget to like and subscribe and click on the bell icon to be notified of our next video.
Why? Because it actually helps us a lot. We were trying to reach 5,000 subscribers by 1 year after starting the work on the boat. We're way ahead of that. And in fact, as of this minute, when we were shooting this, we're now, I don't know, 12 people away from 5,000, somewhere around there. I'd have to look. I'll look a little later. But we're really close to that goal. So thank you all who subscribed this week as well. But any of the likes, the comments, subscriptions, these all help build the channel. So we really appreciate it if you do those things. So thank you so much. We'll see you next week, and we'll be back to work on the boat.
Bye.
Bye.